Hey, what's going on, guys? Kalamazi here. This is going to be my patch 9.2 Destruction Warlock DPS guide. In it, we're going to be covering talents, single target AoE, rotations, Covenant, Soulbinds, Conduits, Legendaries, tier sets, 0-piece, 2-piece, 4-piece, what changes with tier sets, basically everything you can think of for Destruction Warlock heading into patch 9.2. Now, if you guys would like any weak auras, profiles, or add-ons to see here, you can grab them all for free off my Twitch. They are all indeed available to you guys there for free. Should be a link somewhere down below in the actual video description. Also, I want to give one huge shout out to my patrons. Thank you guys a million times for all support. If you're interested in supporting, there should be a link somewhere up here as well as down in the video description below. So that being said, let's get right into it. Just starting off with Destruction's new tier bonuses heading into 9.2. So, starting things off with the Warlock 2-piece, 4-piece tier set heading into Sepulchre, Destruction has what I would say is probably the most exciting tier bonus out of every Warlock spec. It's certainly the most fun to play with, and if used properly, can actually be a very strong damage increase at relevant points in a raid fight or, heavy AoE pulls in Mythic Plus. The 2 set says every 10 soul shards spent grants Ritual of Ruin, making your next Chaos Bolt or Rain of Fire consume no soul shards and have no cast time. So every 10 shards, Chaos Bolt costs 2 shards and Rain of Fire costs 3 shards. So realistically, it's every 3 1/3 Rain of Fire cast or every 5 Chaos Bolt cast. And that instant cast proc, whenever you cast it once you obtain the 4-piece, says when Chaos Bolt or Rain of Fire consumes a charge of Ritual of Ruin, which is the free proc, you summon a Blasphemy for 8 seconds. This Blasphemy is a very large purple Infernal that brings with it basically the same shard generation as your main player-bound Infernal, the Immolation Aura value, which is very strong in AoE. That shard gen is good in single target and AoE as well. And the big thing here is that this Blasphemy brings with it the Reign of Chaos talent, which we'll get to in a minute here. But if you're talented into that actual ability, having that Reign of Chaos window, the 8-second window, active every 10 shards you spend, is very powerful. It leads to a very, very strong synergistic loop of Chaos Bolt cast with more Infernals with the cooldown reduction from your Wilfred's Legendary, which we'll get to in a minute here as well. It's one very, very synergistic build, but in that it's so strong it actually shifts the Legendary and talent that you play as Destro in single target. It makes it basically the same de facto build in every setting, but that won't happen until you get your actual 4-piece for Destro. So we'll talk about that in the actual talent section and legendaries, but it's very important to hit on right now. Until you get your 4-piece, you will play a different talent build in single target and a good portion of 2-target Havoc based cleave settings. But the Destro tier set is very, very strong. One that I really enjoy playing with. There are certain points in fights in Mythic Plus where you can hold your 10-stack instant cast Rain of Fire or Chaos Bolt, pair it with your main Infernal, pair it with your other cooldowns, and just utterly decimate a certain part in a fight where you either meet a damage check or have just an incredible amount of AoE on a large Mythic Plus pull. So when it comes to Destro single target and 2-target based talents in 9.2, in the 15-row, Eradication is going to be your best bet. This talent is already a solid choice in 9.1, sim-wise, and it gains more ground in 9.2 due to the 4-piece giving you more Infernals, more Reign of Chaos uptime, which is more shards, which means more Chaos Bolt cast, which in the end means higher Eradication uptime. The 25 row, we have Entropy as the option you'll play in the vast majority of settings. It gives you a chance to proc a 15% haste increase for 8 seconds upon any kind of spell cast. So it's like a mini Bloodlust for a short duration of time if you're able to proc this, in combat. And during Havoc windows, provides even more value. You can play Shadow Burn at times in very niche settings, like Mythic Kel'Thuzad, for example, where ads are spawning and dying in quick succession, to the point where you can get that Shadow Burn value, the shard refund, for the vast majority of the fight. It's also Havocable, which adds a bit more value in certain scenarios, but for the most part, Entropy is going to be your single target, and for the most part, 2-target cleave-based talent, barring there being a niche fight like Kel'Thuzad. 30 row, you have Burning Rush and Dark Pact as options. Dark Pact, 1-minute cooldown, huge shield. I think it's just a better option in the vast majority of settings. If you need some kind of mobility-based ability, you can take Burning Rush, but for the most part, in raid encounters, you should have Wind Rushes, Roars, and things to give your raid enough mobility to get out of mechanics, and you can just take Dark Pact for a lot of extra survivability. 35 row, we have Cataclysm as your only real option in single target and 2-target. Now, you want to cast Cataclysm on cooldown. It is that strong of an ability. Also, looking at the other 2 options in this row being pretty much just AoE based, it also will apply Immolate to whatever targets it hits. So if there are ads spawning at times during the fight, you can cleave Cataclysm on the multiples. It's a relevant talent. The 40 row in raiding, I think the only real option you have is Mortal Coil. Pretty short cooldown, 20% health. It's pretty solid, and the end cap can be relevant at times if need be for an on-the-fly interrupt or end cap effect on certain fights. Now, when it comes to the 45 row, you have two options, one being Roaring Blaze and the other being Reign of Chaos. Roaring Blaze in single target is going to be your best option until you obtain your 4-piece tier set from the raid. Now, it's basically even with Reign of Chaos and 2-target and Havoc-based windows, but if you pair Roaring Blaze with the Cinders Legendary, which we'll get to in a minute here, that is your best 0-piece and 2-piece talent combination until you get to your 4-piece. When you obtain your 4-piece, Reign of Chaos pulls very far ahead of Roaring Blaze in every kind of single target and 2-target base cleave scenario, due to the 4-piece Infernals giving you 8 seconds of Reign of Chaos whenever they spawn. And finally, in the 50 row here, we have two options being Dark Soul Instability and Soul Conduit. Now, Dark Soul does have a 2-minute cooldown on it. If you play the Wilfred's Legendary with this, which once again, we'll get to in a minute here, there is that large 2-minute cooldown profile, which is relevant in certain settings if there are ads spawning every 2 minutes and you need the kind of, damage output. Soul Conduit is simming higher in single target and 2-target due to the 4-piece tier set. Once again, more Chaos Bolt cast, more Blasphemy procs, just one big loop of synergy. Now, there is some RNG associated with Soul Conduit. At times you get multiple procs back to back. At times you get 0. So the high end of Soul Conduit is higher by a large margin comparatively to Dark Soul, but the lower end is also a good bit lower comparatively to where Dark Soul is actually at. So there's some give and take there. Currently, Soul Conduit is performing better in single target and 2-target. So when it comes to AoE Mythic Plus based talents for destruction, they're mostly the same as the single target based ones with a little bit of variance depending on the setting that you're actually in. So the 15 row Flashover is your only real option here. Once again, the increased conflict rate damage and the extra charge of Backdraft just makes it a very strong option in basically every setting. 25 row Reverse Entropy also gets the nod here, just like what happened in single target talents. There are certain weeks like Explosive, for example, where you do see Shadow Burn played at times to kill explosive orbs. You can one-shot them with a Shadow Burn, thus resetting the actual cooldown and essentially getting some free damage in. But for the most part, I just think Flashover 15 row and 25 Entropy is just the way to go, and there's not really any real reason to play anything else there. 30 row, very similar to what we talked about in the raid talents. Dark Pact gives you a very, very large absorb shield, which can help you live through certain abilities you probably should have moved out of, or just large incoming damage and higher tyrannical keys or fortified keys. If you need the mobility, you can play Burning Rush, but there's not really many settings in the game where Burning Rush is mandatory, and Dark Pact is just so good it's so hard to ignore. It's just so good. So the 35 row, there is a bit of a difference between the raid talents and the Mythic Plus talents. So your options here are either Inferno or Cataclysm. Once again, Cataclysm, 0.5-minute cooldown, applies Immolate to all the targets that it actually hits. It's a strong AoE based ability that whenever you pull a pack, you can Cataclysm, apply 5-6 Immolates right off the bat. There's also the option of Inferno, and this is the talent you see played in the very heavy MDI AoE based builds of Destruction, where you see them hitting hundreds of insane levels of DPS, right? Rain of Fire damage is increased by 20% and has a 20% chance to generate a Soul Shard Fragment. So when we get to the rotation part of this video, we'll look at it a bit more, but what this talent essentially enables is the ability with Reign of Chaos, which we'll get to in a minute here, to just cast Infernals. Cast Rain of Fires over and over and over, which spawns more and more Infernals, which when paired with the Wilfred's Legendary, gives you a shorter cooldown on your main Infernal cooldown, which is one big loop of synergy. Now, this build, playing Inferno over Cataclysm, is a bit lacking in single targets, even more so than Destro was already lacking in the first place. So unless you're in like a organized group that's going to, you're making these very large pulls at this exact point in time and pulling around your Infernal, the vast majority of the time, you see Cataclysm taken over Inferno in Mythic Plus. However, both are decent options. 40 row, similar to the raid talents, a bit more relevancy to Dark Fury, depending if you need extra stuns, but Mortal Coil still does bring that massive 20% heal on a pretty short cooldown, and it can also be Havoc in certain settings if need be, for that in cap and the extra heal if you're really in a tight spot. So the 45 row, similar to the 35 row with Inferno and Cataclysm. Now, there have been some builds that have played Roaring Blaze and Mythic Plus in the past for more of a single target focused oriented build. I think if you're trying to, and it gives a decent cleave based profile as well. Personally, I really prefer Reign of Chaos, and obviously we talked about with these single target talents, Reign of Chaos becomes a much better option than Roaring Blaze, even in single target when you acquire your 4-piece tier set from Sepulchre. Reign of Chaos, once again, whenever you spawn your player-bound Infernal, every shard you spend has a 15% chance to summon an additional Infernal that lasts 8 seconds. And the cool thing with the tier bonus, the 4-piece, is that those Infernals that spawn from there as well also bring Reign of Chaos with them. So you can see multiple Infernals, multiple Rain of Fire casts, Inferno value, more shards coming back in, shorter Infernal cooldowns. It's one huge just loop of synergy, which is why I'd say 9 times out of 10, Reign of Chaos gets the nod over Roaring Blaze when it comes to a heavy AoE and or Mythic Plus based setting. So in the 50 row for Destro in these heavy AoE based settings, the only real option here I feel at this point is Soul Conduit. After playing the Inferno, Reign of Chaos, Soul Conduit build with the 4-piece in Mythic Plus, the actual amount of shard refunds you get playing Soul Conduit, playing Inferno, playing the 4-piece, playing Reign of Chaos, playing your Infernal, it's actually crazy. There are certain points in pulls in heavy AoE where all you cast is Rain of Fire back to back 7 to 8 times due to the insane amount of shard refunds that Soul Conduit provides when paired with Inferno and other, shard-based abilities. If you are playing a 2-minute Wilfred's build, there is the option of playing Dark Soul Instability, which can give you a bit of a better 2-minute, I guess, on-demand kind of burst priority-based profile if need be, but Soul Conduit provides an overall higher level of average DPS because it's essentially, a damage-based cooldown in a sense over the entire duration of whatever encounter you're doing with just partial shard refunds coming in all the time, and is a much better option in the mass heavy AoE base settings. So when it comes to Legendaries for Destruction Warlock in patch 9.2, the two that we currently have played for 9.0 and 9.1, being Cinders of the Azj'aqir and Wilfred's Sigil of Superior Summoning, are still good before it comes to obtaining your 4-piece tier bonus. Now, Cinders is going to be the de facto best go-to single target legendary going into the raid week 1, and honestly until you obtain, well, your 4-piece. The third conflict rate charge, the increased conflict rate damage, and just what it does for the spec when paired with Roaring Blaze is still a very strong option in single target and 2-target Havoc based cleave settings. Now, Wilfred Sigil, to a similar extent, brings that 2-minute Inferno profile, which, if paired with Dark Soul, brings a decent bit of priority burst-based damage. If you're playing Soul Conduit, it still has, that 2-minute profile, albeit a bit shorter because Soul Conduit or Bolt Cast or things like that. You typically see Wilfred Sigil being played in Mythic Plus or a 2-minute Infernal, with Inferno, with Soul Conduit, with the huge AoE build. And when you get those massive pulls with all the Inferno refunds and Soul Conduit refunds, your Inferno can be 1 minute, minute and a half, even at times in heavy AoE, less than 1 minute. Now, the two legendaries that have gained a lot of ground in 9.2, once again, when you obtain your 4-piece tier set, the biggest one is Madness of Azj'aqir. Chaos Bolt increases the damage of Chaos Bolt by 25% and reduces the cast time by 20 for 4 seconds. This currently in Sims is going to be your best single target and 2-target Havoc based cleave legendary, whether you pair it with Soul Conduit or Dark Soul. It does change the single target rotation and Havoc rotation a little bit as well. Basically, you want to go into certain sequences of casting a Chaos Bolt, a filler base spell, and a Chaos Bolt again, to double dip on to just get full value out of that actual, cast time reduction and the damage increase while filling in certain filler spells in between. We'll get to that in a little bit in the rotation section. Now, the final legendary is Embers of the Diabolic Raiment, which in current Sims is below Madness, but still ahead of Wilfred's when it comes to a pure single target build. And this just simply says Incinerate now generates 100% additional soul shard fragments. So both Madness of the Azj'aqir, Embers of the Diabolic Raiment, they both have a lot of synergy with the 4-piece and with Soul Conduit. Soul Conduit, more shards, more bolt cast, Madness, faster bolts, harder hitting bolts, more 4-piece procs, faster and faster and faster. And this is that huge, just one big cycle of synergy that Destro Lock is once you obtain your 4-piece in 9.2. So currently, going into the raid, week 1, no tier bonus, Cinders, your best legendary in single target, 2-target. Wilfred Sigil, your best legendary in Mythic Plus / AoE, and that'll be for basically the entire duration of the patch, theoretically. Once you obtain your 4-piece tier bonus, Madness of the Azj'aqir holds ahead as your #1 legendary in single target and 2-target base scenarios. So when it comes to choosing a Covenant for Destruction Warlock in 9.2, There are two options if you're going to play it in a more competitive base setting, and that is Night Fae and Necrolord. Now, Necrolord currently sims a tiny bit higher in both single target and 2-target cleave base settings with Havoc, while Night Fae sims once again very close in those settings, but higher in 3-target, 4-target heavy AoE base settings. And a lot of that is from its Covenant-based legendary, which is called Decaying Soul Satchel. It says each target affected by your Soul Rot, which is a 1-minute baseline ability, which is, your Covenant one, Soul Rot, increases your haste and critical strike chance by 5% for 8 seconds. Now, the haste part of this legendary is multiplicative, so it means essentially if you pop this during some kind of haste-based effect, like Bloodlust, or whatever kind of other effect you get, like Power Infusion, you get a multiplicative haste stacking amp. The crit is still additive, but this can lead to a very, very large amount of haste every 1 minute with that Soul Rot ability, which has more synergy with Necrolord Soulbinds for Night Fae, which we'll get to in a minute here. Now, so you can see how it gains extra value in these AoE-based settings. If you decide to go Necrolord, the option that you have for your Covenant-based legendary is instead Shard of Annihilation. It says Decimating Bolt, which is a 45-second cooldown and is your Necrolord-based Covenant ability, increases the critical strike chance by 100% for Incinerate, and critical strike damage by 50% for Incinerate. So you can see how one is much better in 2, 3, 4 target settings, which is, Decaying Soul Satchel, and versus one being better in single target. And once again, Necrolord is still a little better in these 2-target base settings, mainly due to the actual, relevancy of cleaving a Havoc with Incinerate, or cleaving an Incinerate with a Havoc, or just casting it in single target. There's a bit of added value with Shard of Annihilation when it comes to playing the Roaring Blaze talent, which is once again, increased fire damage, and Shard of Annihilation increases Incinerate damage, which is also fire damage. However, like we talked about a minute ago, when you obtain your 4-piece tier set from the raid, Reign of Chaos and Wilfred's does indeed still pull ahead, even playing Necrolord, just due to the raw synergy of how strong Reign of Chaos, Wilfred's cooldown reductions are with the 4-set tier bonus. Let's talk a little bit about Soulbinds for each Covenant. So if you opt to go with Night Fae as your Covenant of choice, there are 2 Soulbinds that are of use, one being the one you play in the majority of settings, and that one is called Dreamweaver. So Dreamweaver, number 1, her main ability, the one that brings, I would say, the most value, is called Field of Blossoms. Now, there's a lot of synergy with Field of Blossoms and Decaying Soul Satchel, the Night Fae Covenant legendary. Field of Blossoms says Soul Rot, which is your 1-minute Covenant ability, puts flowers at your feet for 12 seconds that increase your haste by 15% when you stand in them. Keep in mind, once again, Decaying Soul Satchel has a 5% haste amp on it per target hit up to 4, but the haste is multiplicative. So whether you hit 1, 2, 3, or 4, you're going to get the baseline 15% Field of Blossoms haste amp regardless, and that's multiplied multiplicatively by the actual Decaying Soul Satchel haste amp. So this is a pretty strong cooldown based effect on a 1-minute, cooldown. Her other ability is called Dream Delver, which is, it says dealing damage or healing a target grants you 1% increased damage or healing to them for 4 seconds up to 3%. Now this is refreshed by dots like Immolate Ticking, other spells in general, whatever you're hitting a target with. So for the most part, as long as you hit a target with 3 spells, you're probably going to maintain that permanent 3% damage increase for pretty much the duration of actually being alive. Now, Dreamweaver is pretty much your de facto go-to single target, 2-target, cleave, even AoE-based Soulbind, pretty much the vast majority of the time as Destruction. However, the other option is Khorane, which we've seen played at times, like on Soulrun Dormazane, for example, on Kel'Thuzad, and even at times in Mythic Plus, and it's mostly due to her First Strike ability, which says damaging an enemy before they damage you increases your chance to critical strike by 25% for 5 seconds. So unlike Spiteful Weeks, or certain places where you have ad spawning in waves, or Mythic Plus if you're chain pulling a lot, you can maintain a pretty high uptime on the actual First Strike ability, which is very strong. Now, she also has another ability called Wild Hunt Tactics, which is the first one in her entire tree. Your damage to targets above 75% health and healing to targets below 35 is just baseline increased by 10%. So if you're hitting a new target and getting the First Strike damage amp, and then you have Wild Hunt Tactics on top of that, it actually makes her a pretty powerful, just burst, hey, we pulled the new pack, damage amp, right? Now, her final ability is called Wild Hunt Stratagem. When your damage or healing is enhanced by Wild Hunt Tactics, which is once again her very first ability, you gain Wild Hunt Stratagem for 1 minute, which says the next time you damage an enemy who is below 35% health or heal an ally who's below 75, Wild Hunt Stratagem is activated to increase your damage and healing to such targets by 5% for 10 seconds. So there's a lot of like play that you can do with Khura'in in these heavy ad spawn chain pull based settings, which we've seen it at times in the MDI, playing the large Inferno based build with heavy AoE, Spiteful Weeks, for example, on certain raid fights, sometimes paired with Shadowburn. But for the most part, outside of those niche settings, Dreamweaver is typically going to be your Soulbind of choice if you're playing the Night Fae Covenant. Now, if you opt to go Necrolord as your Covenant of choice, Plague Deviser Merilith is the Soulbind that you're going to play in basically every setting, and the majority of his power lies behind the Kevin's Oozling trait, which was acquired in patch 9.1. It is his final passive ability, and it's tied to Decimating Bolt, your Covenant-based ability, which is on a 45-second cooldown. It says Decimating Bolt summons Kevin's Oozling to fight alongside you for 15 seconds. His attacks cause your enemies to take 6% additional damage from you, and he periodically grants your allies an absorb shield that absorbs X damage, right? The big thing here is that, number one, a 6% damage increase is pretty relevant. And number two, when we get double legendaries, we're going to have that big Shard of Annihilation guaranteed crit chance, crit strike damage increase tied to Kevin's Oozling, which is already good on its own, for an even larger damage increase, which makes it a very strong option in single target, even in 2-target cleave based settings, on top of the fact that, once again, Necrolord does sim a tiny bit higher than Night Fae when it comes to these single target and 2-target based settings. It's just a strong all-around option. Plague Deviser Merilith has pulled ahead in 9.1 relatively early on, and for the most part, he's going to be pretty much your de facto Soulbind choice if you do decide to play Necrolord as your Covenant. So when it comes to Conduits for Destruction Warlock in 9.2, Ashen Remains is going to be your number one slotted in, set it and forget it conduit. This thing just straight up basically increases Chaos Bolt and Incinerate damage to your target as long as you're hitting it when it has Immolate applied to it. Now, unless that target's dying in a matter of mere seconds, you should have Immolate on that target. So Ashen Remains is your slot it, set it and forget it, potency conduit number one. Now, typically for the second potency conduit, whether you're in like a single target or cleave based setting, we typically see the actual Covenant potency conduits, which is either Soul Eater for Night Fae, which increases Soul Rot's damage and radius by X amount, or Fatal Decimation for Necrolord, which increases the actual damage of Decimating Bolt's missiles, not the actual effect itself, just due to how strong they are. And they're not like incredibly strong, but they're still solid options in a world of, well, disappointing Destro conduits besides those. Now, I will say, if you're in a 2-target Havoc base setting, Duplicitous Havoc is 100% where you want to be. One of the biggest strengths of Destro Lock is the fact that you can put Havoc on one target, hit another one, and do a good amount of damage to both those. So if you're in a setting where you're going to have 2 permanent targets or a second target a good portion of the time, you'll choose Duplicitous Havoc typically as your third conduit of choice, and that's pretty much where you want to be. If you're playing Destro in a setting where you don't really want Duplicitous Havoc, and your options are the Combusting Engine or Infernal Brand remaining, typically Combusting Engine is the better option until you obtain your 4-piece tier set. When you obtain your 4-piece tier set, Infernal Brand pulls ahead of Combusting Engine by a pretty substantial bit. Infernal Brand essentially gives your Infernals a stacking immolation or a damage increase. The 4-piece brings a large Infernal called the Blasphemy, which does indeed work with Infernal Brand. It has its own little Infernal Brand damage increase. On top of that, that Blasphemy Infernal also brings 8 seconds of Reign of Chaos with it, the talent, which gives you 8 seconds to potentially spawn more Infernals from Reign of Chaos, which those Infernals also have their own Infernal Brand debuff. So you can see, once again, a lot of synergy with the Destro 4-piece, more Infernal Brand value. It just makes the spec exceptionally synergistic in one big loop of synergy. But until you obtain your tier 4-piece, Infernal Brand is not as good. So when it comes to the Destruction Madness of Azj'aqir Soul Conduit 3-minute Infernal opener, it's actually pretty straightforward. You want to precast an Incinerate before the boss is pulled, and also precast a Cataclysm on the boss, so they'll both hit about the same time. At that point, you can Conflagrate, drop your Infernal, pop your Soul Eating Ruby if equipped, and then after all that, pop either your Soul Rot if you're Night Fae. If you're Necrolord, you can pop your Decimating Bolt cast, Intellect Potions, other ratios, other trinkets, and then begin the Chaos Bolt dump window that you have playing Madness. Now, I will say, during your Player Bound Infernal, your main 3-minute cooldown, you're going to get a lot of shards coming in, and Soul Conduit has a certain level of RNG with it, where at times you might be sitting right up against that 5-shard cap, dumping 2 bolts, 3 bolts, 4 bolts, even 5 bolts in a row. But once you leave that Infernal window, outside of your 4-piece Reign of Chaos windows, you maintain more or less this Chaos Bolt X Chaos Bolt kind of spell dump rotation, where, for example, let's say you'll build to about 3.5 shards, cast a Conflagrate, Chaos Bolt, then an Incinerate, and Chaos Bolt again, spending that last shard or so, which allows you to min-max the actual cast time reduction and damage amp on the Madness of Azj'aqir Legendary, and also fill with a spell in between, really like getting just max value out of that buff window. Now, once again, with Soul Conduit, there are times you might go in for, you know, a 2-bolt window and get 3 bolts. It's just sort of the way that this build of Destro plays with Soul Conduit and the 4-piece and random shard refunds. And outside of that, for the most part, you'll cast Soul Rot on cooldown, you'll cast as a main bolt on cooldown, and just follow that, you know, Chaos Bolt X Chaos Bolt, typically Conflagrate Chaos Bolt X Chaos Bolt kind of, well, filler rotation. Now, this build is a 3-minute Infernal build, but the big thing here, unlike the 2-minute build with Wilfred's and Dark Soul, is that this build has a higher average damage output, because that legendary effect in Madness is essentially active for, you know, the entire duration of the fight. So you spike higher with your Infernal on pull every 3 minutes, and you have a higher overall output comparatively to Wilfred's, just not CD windows as often as you do with Wilfred's, being 2 minutes versus 3. So when it comes to Destruction's single target opener, the first thing you're going to want to do is precast an Incinerate. Now, Incinerate has travel time between you and the actual target you're hitting. So when that Incinerate cast finishes, you can typically precast a Cataclysm as well where the boss is standing, so they will hit about the same time when the boss is actually pulled by the tank. Now, when the boss is pulled, you'll want to Conflagrate, cast Summon Infernal. If you're playing a Ruby as a trinket, you can pop it here. Cast your Soul Rot if you're Night Fae. If you're Necrolord, cast Decimating Bolt for either your Field of Blossoms or Decaying Soul Satchel amp or your actual Shard of Annihilation damage amp. And then cast Dark Soul, Intellect Potions, whatever, what have you, your Racials, and then just dump Chaos Bolts. And outside of that point, it's a pretty simple builder spender spec. You want to cast Conflagrate on cooldown, make sure to maintain your actual Immolate buff, make sure you have to overcap on Backdraft stacks, which cap out at 4, and pretty much build shards, spend them, well, casting Chaos Bolts. Now, if you opt to play the Wilfred's Legendary with Reign of Chaos build, your Infernal is going to be somewhere around a 2-minute cooldown, because Wilfred's is a cooldown reduction based Legendary, which means that if you're playing a Soul Letting Ruby for your trinket or another 2-minute based trinket, it should typically line up with your actual Infernal. And the same goes for your Dark Soul ability and other 2-minute based effects, right? So you hold them all for each other. Now, if you're opting to play the Roaring Blaze Cinder Legendary version of Destruction, you're going to have a 3-minute Infernal with no cooldown reduction, but you're still going to have Dark Soul being 2 minutes, and Ruby or other, you know, shorter duration based trinkets being, you know, 2 minutes, give or take a little bit. So the main rule there, which will dictate, it'll depend a bit on the fights you're you know, attempting to kill here, is you want to have your first Infernal line up with your first Dark Soul, and you want to have your final Infernal typically line up with your final Dark Soul for added value, which means that if you Infernal on pull, your next one will be at 3 minutes. If you Dark Soul on pull, you'll have one on pull, and then at 2 minutes. And then your third Dark Soul will be at the 4-minute mark. And your fourth Dark Soul will be at the 6-minute mark. And what's also at the 6-minute mark? Your third Infernal. So depending on the fight you're trying to kill, it might dictate where you want to use these a bit. There are times where you're playing Roaring Blaze Cinders and you just hold your actual Infernal or your Dark Soul for your Infernal every 3 minutes. It'll depend a bit what you're doing, but once again, when you acquire your 4-piece tier set from the actual raid, the 2-minute Wilfred's Reign of Chaos build just becomes the best build in the first place. So I guess the answer is just to get your tier 4-piece pretty fast. So when it comes to Destruction's AoE Mythic Plus heavy cleave base rotation, we talked about it a bit before. Some builds play Cataclysm in the 35 talent row, and some builds play Inferno. Now, if you are playing Cataclysm, you typically will open on that Cataclysm when the pack is being pulled. If you're not playing Cata and you're playing Inferno instead, you typically open on, you know, casting a few Immolates, throw a Conflagrate in, and then once that's done, you summon your Infernal, pop your Ruby if you have it, cast a Conflagrate, and then you pop your Soul Rot if you're Night Fae, Decimating Bolt if you're Necrolord, your Dark Soul if you're playing it, and then just begin casting either Rain of Fires and using Havoc to either cast, Chaos Bolts or generate shards for more Rain of Fires. Now, like we mentioned before, Rain of Fire is a DPS gain at 3 or more targets when your Havoc is on cooldown. It's a DPS gain in general at 5 or more targets inside of the Havoc window, and which is even better if you're playing Inferno the Talent. So that sort of dictates if you're going to use your Havoc window to either cast Incinerates and Conflagrates to generate shards, and then cast Rain of Fires in that Havoc window, or if you're going to use the Havoc window just to say, all right, cool, I'm going to cast Chaos Bolts, which once again, 3 to 4 targets, you still want to do that. But at 5 or more, you will use the Havoc window to build shards to fuel more Rain of Fires. Now, we also mentioned Dark Soul in that opener. If you are playing the Inferno build, more often than not, you're probably going to be playing Soul Conduit as well over Dark Soul. So you're not going to have that 2-minute cooldown. What you're going to have is Soul Conduit, which brings even more shard refunds, more shard generation, which sort of stacks in a sense with the Inferno talent, which gets more value with Reign of Chaos, with Wilfred's, with the Destro 4-piece tier set. So it's one huge loop of synergy. And at a certain point, depending on RNG, it can get to the point where all you're casting is Rain of Fires because your shard gen is just so out of control. All you can do is just spam Rains. And that's when you have multiple 4-piece procs coming in. And if the 4-piece Blasphemy Infernal is still down when you proc another one, it will not actually summon a second Blasphemy, but it will extend the duration of the current one and do like a pulsing AoE from that large purple Infernal. So you can see how the actual value of this build just compounds upon itself over and over and over in really heavy AoE. And playing Wilfred's, the CDR legendary, it means that in a group that's maybe built around a Destro lock, playing this build to solo trash packs, as long as it's you're making those pulls based around that cooldown window, this is an exceptionally strong build when it comes to Mythic Plus. Might be a bit lacking in single target, but hey, bring some other classes for it because our AoE can be very, very strong. So when it comes to 2-target Havoc-based cleave settings as destruction, there's a general, I guess you can say, rough template or a few rules that you sort of want to follow when you're trying to head into a Havoc window. Now, typically you want to head in somewhere around the 2.5 to 3.5 shard mark, which gives you time to, apply Immolate to both your targets, apply your Havoc to one target, and then Conflagrate the other, thus duplicating, the Conflagrate cast, giving you one full shard. So if you entered at 2.5 shards, you'd be around 3.5 now, give or take. If you entered around 3, you'd be at about 4, which you could just quite literally launch 2 Chaos Bolts back to back at that point. And then for the most part, you want to just cast Conflagrates on cooldown in the Havoc window, cast Incinerates if need be, and really just try and dump as many Chaos Bolts as possible for as much, 2-target / funnel base damage as possible as well. Now, like we mentioned, if you're in a heavy AoE based setting with 5 or more targets, you don't typically want to cast those Chaos Bolts in there. You want to instead use this window for shard generation, which is by casting Conflagrates and then Incinerates and using those Rain of Fires that are instant cast in that window to spam the shards. I will say though, even in a 5+ target setting, if there is a mini boss or a heavy priority mob that needs to die, you can still very well use that Havoc window to cast Chaos Bolt on it. Because in the end, if a mob is going to kill you, you want to, kill it before it kills you. And that's more important in the long run than doing mass AoE damage. Now, if you're looking at a certain pet to play for Destruction Warlock in 9.2, the Imp has typically been the de facto go-to pet when it comes to raiding. Each pet has its own unique ability as far as utility is concerned. The Imp is a ranged caster. So, for example, instead of using the Fell Hunter, we use the Imp typically in most raid and PvE-based settings because the Imp can change targets at range. If I tell it to hit one target and I tell it to hit the other, it can just turn and cast, without running between one and the other. It also brings an ability called Singe Magic, which is a dispel. It's been used a decent bit of times in higher end, just in raid progression, even when it comes to Mythic Plus. Now, the Fell Hunter, on the other hand, is a melee-based mob. So if I tell it to attack one target here and have it run, 10 yards that way, there's travel time between that. So it doesn't have the same uptime as the Imp necessarily would when it comes to range damage. The Fell Hunter, however, has an interrupt with it, which is very, very strong in Mythic Plus, and at times in raid settings, because you can tell the Fell Hunter to move across the room, essentially AFK, but you can have it kick a mob or interrupt a mob way across the room, thus allowing a different raid member to stay in and attack, you know, a different part of the boss without losing any kind of real relevant downtime. Because in the end, hey, a pet kicking it's better than you having somebody else run way across the room, right? The Fel Hunter also brings a Devour magic effect, which is a purge, which can be useful at times in Mythic Plus and things like that. Now, the Voidwalker is your tank pet, which we really don't see used very often when it comes to PvE based settings like in Mythic Plus or raiding. It does have a taunt on it, so it has been used at times to taunt a boss off a tank, to take a debuff, a big rend or whatever, and then just summon it again and it will do it again. I believe SLG was a great example of that. Outside of that, it's really only used when it comes to like solo content if you need a tank pet. The final pet, which is very interesting, is the Succubus or Incubus. This pet has not really been used in any kind of relevant PvE-based setting until now. Blizzard has changed its ability. It's called Whiplash, which it increases the actual damage taken by the Succubus or Incubus by 1%, but it stacks 10 times on a 6-second cooldown. So after a minute, as long as you're hitting the same target, the Succubus or Incubus you have out will essentially be doing 10% more damage than the Voidwalker or the Fel Hunter or the Imp would be. Now, pet damage is normalized, so outside the Succubus having this new change, the Imp, the Voidwalker, the Fel Hunter, and previously the old Succubus will all do the same damage in combat. But this is interesting because this buff is a 6-second cooldown, so it takes an actual minute, you know, to maintain or to stack it to 10 stacks. But when you do, Succubus is doing 10% more damage to that actual target. Now, if it's a fight where there's a lot of target swapping, a heavy ad-based fight, this is a melee-based pet, so it does have to run between targets depending what you're telling it to hit, and at the same time, you have to maintain that Whiplash buff. But if you're in a single target-based encounter, or you're hitting one target for pretty much the entire fight, the Succubus or Incubus, as long as the Whiplash debuff doesn't drop, will essentially do 10% more damage to that actual target. But if not, and you can't maintain it, the Imp is probably your best choice if you don't need a kick in the Fel Hunter. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys. I hope this video answered all the questions you might have had about Destro heading into 9.2 and some of the recent changes with Soul Conduit and new legendaries and rotations and things like that. Now, I'm pretty excited for Destro in the raid and Mythic Plus in 9.2. I'm a little apprehensive to say we're not going to get some kind of tuning, buffs, nerfs to our AoE, but we'll see where all that goes. Either way, I have not played a spec this fun in Mythic Plus with heavy AoE, multiple rain of fires back to back to back since actual Shadowlands beta. It feels like Shadowlands beta in a sense, which is, well, the last time we got nerfed. But hey, you know what? We've made it this far. Maybe we'll make it a little farther. Any week wars, profiles, or add-ons you guys saw here, once again, are all indeed available free on my Twitch. If you want to swing by, grab them, hang out, ask any questions anytime, feel free to do so. I also want to give one huge shout out to my patrons one more time. Thank you for all the support, guys. If you're looking at supporting, it should be a link somewhere up here, as well as down in the video description below. If you have any questions that I might have not answered, or any comments or anything, also feel free to drop them down below in the comment section. I'll be sure to get back to you. And while you're down there, smash the like and sub buttons. It helps out a ton. Thanks again for watching, dudes, and I'll catch you all again soon on stream. Peace.